Hello, it's me again. I'm actually at the beginning of my shift, so this is going to be another quick one, but I wanted to push through some of the pile up of Q&A I have. I actually have quite a few questions to move through, and I wanted to get started on that as quickly as possible. So, a couple things really quick. I did check out several of the podcast links or rather sites that I was mentioned about last night, and I have looked into them. I've got an account going on one of them. I'm going to go ahead, when I finish one of these videos tonight, I'm going to bring it home, rip the audio, and try it out and see, if it's worth anything and how it works and blah blah blah. So we'll see. But the earliest update on that's going to be tomorrow because I need to rip the audio, which requires me being at home. Second thing, um, the links in the timestamp thing. I spent about 25 minutes going through and taking down the times and getting all the time links and editing it in, and I punched it in, and I was like, all right, I'm ready to go. And that's when I discovered there's a character limit on how big a description can be, and I'm like, okay, well, how big am I over that limit? Oh, I was about 3,000 characters over it. So then I parsed it down a lot, which took more time, and made the links the much smaller links, and made the actual questions much smaller, more abbreviated versions, and found out that I was a little over 1,800 characters over at that point. So the net result, which I did for yesterday, and I'll do again for Q&As in the future, is I'm just going to go ahead and put the time there written and an abbreviation of the question, because that was for a 22-minute video, which I just kind of blew through, and I usually have my Q&As much longer than that, so that doesn't seem feasible in the future unless there's a much shorter way to do that link that I'm unaware of, which is very possible because, as I said, I'm not a YouTube person. I've never been an internet person as far as, to interwebs, doing the YouTube thing and the Facebook thing and the Twitter thing. Never been my thing. So, I admit my ignorance, but that's as best as I got right now. Now, let's go ahead and get to these questions. First question. Did you try the Rising Force Online MMO? Yes, I did. I tried it in the beta, of course. I didn't care for it personally, but it did have some potential. It has this, it's hard to explain actually, but it's this political chip war system, which sounds really good on paper. I don't know how it actually turned out in retail, but in the beta it was pretty well slanted towards the Bellado, or however you actually pronounce this. I'm not actually sure off the top of my head. But I ended up putting it down because it was a heavily PvP focus, and you can go ahead and insult me if you want for that, for being a Care Bear or whatever. While I enjoy PvP, and I tend to be very good at PvP, I do not like having forced PvP. I like having the option. If you have the ability to kill me when I'm not in the mood to bother, no. So, that's just my opinion, of course, and my preference. Next question. Have you ever played Shining Force 1 and 2, Blood Rain 1 and 2, or Armored Core? I've played all of the games mentioned previously. I really enjoyed the Shining Force series. Those games didn't get a lot of attention, and not as much as I thought they should have. The whole pseudo strategy game, and then of course they had that recent one, the Shining Force Neo, whatever the heck it was called, which was essentially a Diablo 2 clone, which was just kind of out of left field. But that was also a surprisingly enjoyable game. So shrug, I suppose. Blood Rain. It was a very Devil May Cry game, in my opinion, but without any of the appeal of Devil May Cry, and it never really seemed to find its particular niche. It never actually found the one thing that it could hang on to and make its core audience out of, at least in my opinion. So I never actually got into Blood Rain. I played it, and I put it down, and I walked away. The Armored Core games always felt like a bit of a substitute for games which I tend to enjoy much more, which is the MechWarrior series of BattleTech. And thanks to the fact that MechWarrior kind of fell off the face of the earth as far as video gaming goes, I did end up getting into Armored Core, but most especially, I wrote it down. What was the name of the recent one? Oh, maybe I didn't write it down. There's one that came out rather recently, like just a couple years ago, and I did actually, it was a little hokey, and the voice acting was a little terrible, but it was still enjoyable. I still got into it, and I personally prefer BattleTech, and I really hope they bring MechWarrior back, but nothing against Armored Core. Next question. What is my opinion on BioWare's quality? Do I think it has gone down? Now, this is a difficult call to make since only 2 games have come out since the Fantastic line has been dropped beneath. But literally speaking, yes, the last 2 games they've made have been subpar per their usual, and we'll see. The Mass Effect 3 DLC may or may not fix anything, but what is really going to tell whether or not Bioware has dipped the third game that's going to come out, which is going to be Dragon Age 3. That will be the real kicker as to whether or not Bioware is off the radar, so to speak. And even as is right now, none of their games are automatic buys anymore like they used to be. It's they're in the same boat as every other company. You know, they have to justify themselves. Now, this is an amusing question, because this was answered by several of my commentators, and I'm not 100% sure that this was meant to be a question for the Q&A, but I'm going to answer it anyways. I actually wrote down some real notes on this one. Why do I hate EA so much? EA represents everything that is wrong with corporate society, and does something to it. It enforces, I'm sorry, I keep tripping over my words here. It enforces corporate society on something that I personally care about a great deal. Video games. And they take something that can and should and has been art, and something that can really be a very enjoyable hobby and a reason to, enjoy life, and they turn it into a process. They turn it into a machine, and it loses something. And they what they do is they absorb companies. This is the literal reason EA is a bad company. You could say they just make bad decisions, whatever. What it actually comes down to is they'll absorb a company, and that company got successful. They always buy companies that are already at least moderately successful, and they say, all right, you've been moderately successful, but we need to make sure we can guarantee money back. What do they call it? They need to prevent them from taking any risks, and all the really good games that have ever been made, basically ever, with a few exceptions, are games that took risks and tried something that was new or tried something that they weren't sure was going to work. And it usually, when that happens and it works, and it does actually work, it pays off. That's how that kind of works, And so EA takes those companies and says, all right, we're not going to let you take any risks. You need to do something safe. You need to do something we know works. We need to do something we know is popular right now. We need to dumb it down a bit, get it down to here, get it down into the safe round, and so it'll still buy, and they could maintain, hold their confidence, and blah, 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 blah. And I know there's a lot of corporate mechanics involving why this sort of thing happens, and I really don't want to go into it because it's kind of depressing as much as I know about it. Yeah. So let's just move on. But there is one other thing I want to talk about EA, other than the fact that they are the exemplified version of what I dislike about corporations in general. They personally have nuked several things, series, individual games, and whole companies that I really enjoyed and that I really liked. Let's just throw out some examples here. I got a nice list here. The Command and Conquer series. Anyone remember those? It's technically still going, but you can't really say that, can you? Anyone remember Bullfrog? Anybody? I remember Bullfrog. They were awesome. Anyone remember Origins? How's that for one? That was a big name once upon a time that got absorbed into EA and then just kind of chopped up. Maxis, of course, Maxis. My goodness, that was another big one back in the day, and then there's one other really big one that just really bothers me. A specific individual game they nuked off the face of the planet for the stupidest of reasons. Earth and Beyond, which was one of my favorite MMOs, still is one of my favorite MMOs to date, and was making money, and it just wasn't making enough, and so they couldn't actually hit their margin, and so they nuked it. And that's actually when they fully absorbed Westwood as well. So, and the list goes on and on and on and on, but I just want to point out one other thing. A lot of people have been really getting on the EA bashing train in these recent years. The most recent time I can remember hating EA was 1992. I want you to think about that for a moment. EA has been doing this process, absorbing companies and forcing them to dumb themselves down and to take things safe and to not take risks, and destroying works of art since 1992. That is why I hate EA. What is my opinion on achievements and trophies in games? I do admit I'm a bit of an achievement monger, or whatever you want to call it. Because most of the time it's fun to do it. Most of the time it's things that are just extra little challenges to say, yeah, I could do, this boss or this level or whatever, but I can do it like this. And I like having the little display, hey, you did this, and I could say, hey, I did this, If I were to highlight a game that does it best, in my opinion, I would probably say WoW. Because they tend to be purely cosmetic, or give a very slight buff in the form of the achievements, like the guild achievements, for example. But otherwise, it's all in good fun. It's just something you're doing because you want to. which I think most people seem to forget sometimes, that the whole point of the achievements is not to be rewarded for it, but because it's fun, and I like that. Now, of course, there are exceptions in WoW itself as well, but in many games there's the, go grind your face off for 700,000 hours, or do this ridiculous excess stupidity, or grind, or both. Those achievements I don't get into, and I usually just kind of put those to the side and say, yep, never doing that one. So, that's my thought on achievements, though. How much time does it take to make preparations for a review or a Q&A? This question actually amused me because while I was preparing this list I'm staring at right now of all these questions, it was fairly late in the morning after I'd gotten home from work, and I'd already at that point spent an hour and a half compiling all these questions together and getting some notes together. So yes, I spend a fairly large amount of time preparing for these videos, most especially the game reviews, but the Q&As as well. Especially now that I'm going to be putting the questions into the videos and putting little time, not actual clickable timestamps, the thing I'm going to start doing. And whenever I have to make an edit, that usually adds like another 20 minutes to the time just because of how long it takes to process these videos. Even if I'm just chopping out a section where I had to answer a phone call, that still takes a fairly long period of time. And of course, I like to walk into these prepared, and while I don't always get my facts right because I'm not some immortal super demigod or whatever, the simple fact is I do actually try to do some research, and I do try to look into things, and I do try to be like, okay, let's refresh myself. And of course, with the game reviews, I want to either have played them recently or play them immediately. When I was doing my reflective reviews late last year, I would actually play that game for at least a bit that week when I did that review in order to make sure it was fresh in my mind. So yeah, there's a fairly large amount of time I put into these things. I do try, If you could choose one genre you would like to be made into an RPG that hasn't been made so far, which would you pick? Now, I thought about this for a while. I'm pretty sure just about every genre that exists out there has been made into an RPG format at this point. It wouldn't actually surprise me if that's true. But ignoring that fact, if I had to pick of my favorites, games I really would like to see come into, excuse me, into an RPG genre, I would have to say either the real-time tactical and strategic real-time combat, by which I mean like, I've said it before, if I could combine Civilization and, just in general, let's go and use Civ 5 as a recent example. Civilization 5 and Master of Orion 2 and Homeworld into one game, and then add RPG elements to that. That would be awesome, and I'd buy that brand new. But also space sims in general, as I keep saying over and over, I keep bashing on about this product. But like the old games like Freelancer or Frontier Elite or Earth and Beyond, as I just mentioned earlier. These are games that did the the space sim, the whole your avatar is your ship thing, and add RPG elements, and I like that, and so I'd like to see more of that, especially done well. That's always the trick. I always have to add that. It has to be done well. You can't just do it. It's not an automatic win button. It doesn't work that way. But anyways, what TV or movie would you most like to see made into a single-player RPG or an MMO? Now, this is a difficult one. I've said many times that the reason that video game movies and movies based on video games, both directions is my point, tend to fail is because you're crossing mediums, and most people don't take that into account. You're taking something that is essentially a fully interactive, or at least partially interactive, method of storytelling and turning it into a completely non-interactive, much, much, much shorter form of storytelling. People say, for example, the Call of Duty games are short because you can blow through that campaign in like 4 to 5 hours, right? Imagine a 4 to 5 hour movie, And we're talking extremes here. Even the longest of movies tend to never go past the 3-hour mark. So it's just a complete shift in format, in style, and everything. And you really have to take that into account. Now, that being said, I would absolutely beyond love for them to take the concept of Homeworld, the story and the Star Wars concept thing, and turn that into a movie. And if I was going to be really ambitious and we had a blank check scenario, I would make it more in the format of the original Star Wars trilogy, with, how do I even put those? Like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of this in the wrong direction. Let me take this over here, because I'm sorry. I completely answered that incorrectly. I was answering which game would I want to see be made into a movie. Which movies I would want to see made into a game would be the Star Wars trilogy. And of course, the automatic response I'm sure all of you giving is that's been done like 20 times. No, 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 no. Imagine if they came out with a game that was really an epic RPG with homeworld type combat for the space combat and I don't know, just off the top of my head, Half-Life type combat, or maybe not even Half-Life. Let's stick with Half-Life with a little mix of Devil May Cry in there, Devil May Cry 3 specifically, for the ground-based combat, and then very heavy RPG elements all throughout. Lots of extensive story. Well, let's go and use Mass Effect, the original, or Mass Effect 2 if you prefer, for the conversation and cutscene concept and make the movies into a game format like that. And when I say that, I mean play every single type of format that that game would be. You know, it would be a genre-crossing game, and it would be awesome if it was done right. And that's the trick. That would be incredibly difficult to do and incredibly time-consuming. And again, that would have to be a blank check scenario, as I started to say. You know, that would have to be the true. You know, okay, we're going to take the next 10 years and do this with no money concerns, which is why that's never going to happen. But that would be awesome, I think. Next question. Do you think they should set Fallout 4 in a large city such as New York or Chicago? I personally feel that the next Fallout game should follow either one of two paths structurally. You can either have it set in a massive urban environment like the pit was, taken to its furthest extreme, like with the whole game you're exploring is the massive sprawl of the city and the cityscape, you know, and there would be a lot of indoor sections. You know, Fallout 3 had a bit of indoorsishness, but not really. There was no. Most of the indoors was actually separate zones, like the Elder Scrolls games do in general. But what I mean is actually have renderings of the walls and the windows, and you can actually go into that building without hitting a load screen and interact with things in and out like that, and have that kind of a sprawling cityscape, which I think would be really excellent. Or you could do basically the exact opposite and have a vast and open terrain that's barely touched at all. Some massive area like the Midwest would probably be a good example. I'm sure that got nuked into oblivion. And have only sparse, really small settlements here and there, and so you really get the feel of the wild, and have the storyline involve you reclaiming the wild, that kind of thing. But that's just my thing, and I like both concepts, and ironically enough, both concepts allow for the sort of freedom and openness I would want. So shrug. Let's see. Next question. This is actually a bit simplified, but the question essentially is, when are you getting a Dreamcast? Now, let's make something absolutely clear. I agree fully that the Dreamcast had some amazing games on it. Let's see. We had Skies of Arcadia, we had Grandia 2, Crazy Taxi, a bunch of other games like that. The problem is what I call the Suikoden 2 obstacle. Dreamcasts had what amounts to a limited print run and were not as successful as they could have been at the time. So now they are more desired than they were then, is kind of my point. And this happens to a lot of things in a lot of mediums, video games especially. This comes out in video games, like with Suikoden 2. Suikoden 2 still has not had an additional print run, which means that getting a hold of that game is going to involve a lot of money. Same problem with the Dreamcast. Now, you could say that, well, you can go buy a used one for $30, but that has its own problems, because it's possible that you may be getting a Dreamcast that doesn't work, or has a problem with it, or has a significant problem with it. And then yes, you're only out $30, but now you have a non-functional Dreamcast in your same boat as when you started. And so, for various reasons, I have not risked picking up a Dreamcast, even though I would if I won the lottery or something like that. I would like to. Next question. What state do you live in? I'm actually not going to answer this question, but for various reasons, most of which involve the internet. I do live in. I was primarily raised on the west coast of the United States, and that's about all I'm going to give you. But I'm not there now. Next question. How old are you? Another question I try not to answer, partially because it's just become a habit over the years, and partially because, again, the internet. I will give you guys a hint. I was there when the Commodore 64 came out. Now, what do I think about the inventory in RPGs? Do I prefer the magic bag of holding or the Diablo-style pieces take space system? Now, honestly, I like both in their own environments. Let's Let's be honest. In general, I tend to prefer the former, the magic bag of holding, Final Fantasy style, if you want a specific game to attach that to, especially since the FF's added a sort button, because it takes a lot of the hassle out of it. And I've always said that hassle, especially in a UE, is something that shouldn't be in a video game, especially an RPG. There's no need to make it irritating every time you have to go and put this item here and check the stats and equip the item. No. You can streamline all that nowadays with the technology and with the ability we have now with the code to do that. So, I like that system for in general. However, I do want to point out that the Tetris style of doing inventory does have its own time and place. I'm going to name a game that people are probably going to look at me really weird here for. Resident Evil 4. I thought that did that very well because in a game of that style, in a game of that tone, it's not an irritation. It's more a thought of, well, okay, do I want to keep this or do I want to keep this? Or can I get rid of both in order to keep this? And you actually have to make choices. And you have to make decisions on how exactly you want to sort your inventory and what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of. And you can't just hoard everything like gamers in general tend to do. And so I like that. I like how it added to the flavor. Now, it is also worth noting that the Tetris-style inventory can be done very wrong as well. I can use Resident Evil 5 as the example there of how to do that very poorly. And I'm not going to go into that in the specifics of that, but any of you know what I'm talking about probably understand. And yeah, so it depends on how you pull it off, but if I had a choice, I would go with the former. Next question. Why do you think developers have such a hard time making superhero-based RPGs, and if you were to make an RPG, how would you do it? Honestly, in my opinion, superhero RPGs should be either co-op multiplayer, PvP-based, or fully single-player. Now, you could probably actually do all three in a single game, but, different game modes. But the very nature, the very concept of a superhero is someone who is the center stage, someone who either by themselves or with their groups or with their enemies uh, basically takes the spotlight no matter what the circumstances are. And if you have something like say an MMO, it's very difficult to translate that feeling into that because there's just this flood, and in my opinion it detracts from it, and you no longer feel like a superhero, you no longer feel like an anything, you feel like just another guy. And yeah, you could make arguments on this back and forth, but this is just my opinion on the matter. I don't think an MMO is well suited to a superhero type game because of the basic format of the concept of the premise. Now, if I were to make my own game, as you mentioned, like I said, ideally I'd give it all three. I'd give it a very strong single-player campaign that could be played cooperatively, but doesn't require it. It just adjusts itself. And I would probably add some challenge missions, basically, or fun missions. I'm trying to think of a good example of this one. But the idea here is that these fun missions, if we were to equate this, would be just like one or two issues. You're fighting this villain in this area to stop this plot, but it's not even really a plot. It's just a minor problem you're trying to fix, as opposed to the campaign, which is this massive story arc that takes place over this whole book of comics. Excuse me. And of course, those could be played cooperatively as well. And then, of course, there would be a multiplayer section, and I'm sorry, when I say multiplayer, I mean PvP, where you'd have just a chunk of land, like a city would be a great example, and I'd make the physics destructo physics. I know that's not the proper term, but that's what I've always called it. So the two, you and your other PvP buddies can just demolish the city and each other as you go through, and I think that would be a lot of fun. It doesn't have to be a city. It could be like a power plant. It could be like a dam. There's all sorts of the classic superhero and supervillain fight locations that you can do for that. But that's how I would do it. And of course, consequently, I would make it so that you could make a superhero or a supervillain with your own abilities for the PvP section. But that's what I do. Scrolling down a bit. This was one of those questions that was asked twice. Why did you choose to play as FemShep? Do I normally play female characters? Do I roleplay myself or as characters? And the second question, and the way it was phrased, was, do you feel the overall experience is better playing as her? Was the voice acting better, or was it just cosmetic? Now, to be completely honest, the actual answer why I chose to be female Shepherd is far geekier than I really feel like going into right now. Nothing bad. It's just really, really geeky. But, and I'm not going to bore you with that. But I will freely admit that Jennifer Hale was at least part of that decision because Jennifer Hale is an amazing actress. Whether the fact that she's female is essentially irrelevant. It's more the fact that she is an excellent actress, and so having her as my voice, so to speak, or the voice I listen to the primary majority of the time, as opposed to the gentleman whose name I don't even know, which I guess makes my point for me, is is something that I could go for. Is something that I would prefer. I will. As for whether or not I play female or male characters, honestly, it's kind of 50-50. Just to use WoW as an example, I have a male Tauren, Blood Elf, Worgen, Goblin, and a female Draenei, Blood Elf, and Undead. And so it just kind of depends on the cosmetics and the aesthetics of the specific race and the specific game or whatever. And so I would never actually lean one way or the other. Voice acting tends to add to that too. Diablo 3 is an excellent example. I much prefer the Witch Doctor male because I think his voice actor does a better job with the lines than the female. Nothing against male or female, it's just I think that individual does a better job with the lines, blah blah blah. As for the last question, again, it depends on the circumstances, but it is actually very rare that I will roleplay as myself in a game. Far more often I'm roleplaying other characters. The only games I ever really tend to roleplay myself is something like the Elder Scrolls series, where I can be the Mario, and actually try and help save the world and make it a better place, in addition to stopping the big threat against it. That kind of a game is the kind of game where I'll play myself. I did that with Dragon Age 1 as well. But those are basically the exceptions. Everything else, I make a new personality type, I guess, design, character, whatever you want to call it, for the person that I am role-playing. Or rather, I'm not role-playing, I guess I should say. Yes, I'm a geek. What do you want from me? Next question. What was your shepherd's name? Zaydenra. And there's a long and complicated story behind why, which I'm not going into. What do you think of fighting games? This is another one of those questions that was really shrunk. But I personally really enjoy fighting games a lot. I didn't really get into the ground floor per se, but I did start playing with Street Fighter, Art of Fighting, Fatal Fury was another good one, and really got going. Street Fighter 2 was the one that really dragged me in per se, but there were a lot of others in the third or fourth generation, like Virtua Fighter by Sega, which was also on the Dreamcast, and I really enjoyed a lot of fighting games in the day. One of the things that was implied in the question, as it was originally phrased, was that he felt or she felt that fighting games were something that helped you stay mentally focused, helped you develop up here. And I actually tend to agree with that. You can say whatever you want about button mashing, because that is a problem. But when you're trying to play well, and you're trying to play good, and you're trying to play at level, like, I never actually got into professional playing, but I certainly played a lot of local tournaments. When you get into that sort of thing, you start to really get in, there's a lot of memory challenge, figuring out what moves look like, exactly what your own combos are, and what they can do if they're coming at you from this angle, or from this angle, or if they jumped all the way up, There's so many things to memorize, and there's so many things to have ready to go just like that, and there's a lot of reflexes involved, and so it really helps keep you on your toes, if you know what I mean, if you're trying to be really good. I personally did find it very stimulating, but actually not for the professional reason, for the tournament reason. While I did do tournaments, like I said, what happened to me was my mum, would take me to the local arcade to get some paperwork done, and so she'd sit there and sip her coffee or whatever and do her paperwork while I went to the arcade and played. Now, this gave me a very strong motivation to make the quarters last, because she was going to be a couple hours and I only had like $2 or something like that. And so I really had to stretch that, and I got good at the games, and especially the fighting games, so that I could play them longer, and so that those quarters would last longer. And I actually got really proud of the fact that I could go there and not even spend all the money she gave me. I could give some back at the end of the things I hear, because I could stretch it out. And so back in the day, obviously I'm way out of practice now, but back in the day I was really good at fighting games and I really enjoyed that. Now, there is one other thing I feel like noting, and that is that fighting games, when you're really at the really good level, are very enjoyable to watch. It's like watching really good StarCraft players, if you know what I mean, because while I am not that good personally, I am good enough to recognize how good they are. And I'll give you a great example of that. 2004, Diego and Justin. That fight, oh my god. I actually pulled up that fight when I was looking at this question just to refresh myself on it and remind myself on how amazing that fight was. And just, oh yeah, I wish I'd been there. But, that's an excellent example of a truly amazing fight that a fighting game can do, and how complicated it can get. And I'm going to stop talking about fighting games now. So, Next question. Have you ever played Captain Forever? The question asker here described this as a popcorn game, and I agree. It is enjoyable. It's good. I don't have any actual complaints about the game. Um, but it's not something I really got into. It's not something I really invested myself in. So yes, I have played Captain Forever, and I do recommend it for anyone who wants to play just a nice, simple game to enjoy for a while. But there is one thing I really like about it. It's the concept of the expanding modular gameplay, which it does very well, which I guess it's still doing to this day. And I'd like to see more of that in games in general, if people could manage it. Have you ever played any RTS games like Halo Wars? Now, I'm going to assume this question was asked in a certain way, because of course I've played RTS games. I've talked about them at length, and I've played a lot of them. It's one of my favorite genres, but I'm assuming you mean, have I played an RTS like Halo Wars itself? Now, Halo Wars I have not played because it's an Xbox exclusive. However, I did do some looking into it, and it looked like a fairly rock paper scissors story-based campaign RTS with Warhammer style resource system. So yes, I have played that type of RTS more than once, and I do enjoy that. Not personally my favorite. I'd say probably my third favorite in actual types of. Actually fourth types of RTS. But still a type I enjoy, still a type I get into, and absolutely nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Next question. Have you ever played Star Fox? God, yes, I've played Star Fox. I've played Star Fox everything. When I finally get to the point where a 3DS has justified itself in its game library that's out, because it technically already has, but a lot of those games aren't out yet. Um, which, by the way, July 31st of this year, I think, is the time it's going to tip over the line for anyone who knows what that means. But the Star Fox 64 remake is one of the games that I'm going to buy in that very first bundle because I'm really looking forward to it. Star Fox 64 I enjoyed a lot. I played on the N64 constantly. I really enjoyed the original Star Fox. I really enjoyed Armada, believe it or not, on the GameCube. I thought that was a lot of fun. And if this will blow your mind, I actually enjoyed Star Fox Adventures. I know that's crazy. I didn't enjoy it nearly as much, but I still enjoyed it. It wasn't because it was Star Fox. I admit I picked it up because it was Star Fox, but I enjoyed it because it wasn't Star Fox. Anyways, and in case you were asking, I'd probably say N64 version, or rather the remake, is my favorite, and with the DS one, which is Command, after that. Love those series. Now, do you think? Okay, I actually wrote a bit of a script for this one, which I'm gonna adhere to. Do you think the fan argument over Mass Effect 3's ending would have more clout if the fan base as a whole would speak more as consumers than fans? Next question is: do you think any of the reporters involved did research on both sides of the debate? As usual, Mass Effect 3 is stalking me. I just can't get away from it. Now, like I said, I'm just gonna read from what I already wrote here. I don't think, in all honesty, anything that we did could have changed the debacle that was the Mass Effect 3 ending. If we had known in advance, thanks to time travel, and had clamored, ahead of time, maybe. But the damage was done the moment it came out, and as I've stated many times, the actual problem cannot be fixed because the actual problem is that the ending came out as is. Even if they intended to fix it, even if they intended to do things, the attitude they had and the fact that it came out, that the retail release was like that, means that the initial difficulty still exists. They can still fix it, but the problem will never go away because the problem was the fact that they were okay with releasing it like that at all. And when I say they, I am not talking about Bioware. I am not talking even about EA necessarily. I mean the aggregate. The overall group of people who were involved in the release of this game. Now then, even if the DLC fixes that, which is immensely unlikely, the problem, as I said, remains, and it will stain consumer confidence in the future. Now, with that out of the way, I do think it would have had less internet backlash if people who were opposed to the ending had voted and spoken more as consumers than as fans. Not to say plenty of people didn't. I've seen plenty of them, and Lord knows GameStop is well aware of the issue, at least given how many returns they were getting. But every time I went to the forums at BioWare or GameFAQs or any other site, when the issue was still running hot, the majority of the posts I saw were people who were ranting or raging and using unpleasant language and poor spelling and grammar with no actual coherence to it. And the people who probably did not return their game or otherwise spoke as consumers didn't really seem to be that concerned about the dissatisfied product they received, if I'm putting that right. My point is that I don't think... I think the people who were going to speak with their wallets already did, and I think everyone else was just kind of not treating it as it should have been treated, to be completely honest with you. Yes, it was a terrible thing, but we need to speak with this seriously. We need to not just devolve into, rawr. Second question's answer. I do not think most of the people who covered the issue went into any kind of detail that was required for something that was as complicated as the situation has become. I'm going to give you a direct example here. I'll never forget this. I saw a snippet on some news program. I don't even remember which news program. And it had some guy who was being interviewed about several games things, and he mentioned the issue with Mass Effect 3's ending and how terrible it was and how people were getting upset about it. And the female reporter, who was clearly uninterested, clearly condescending in her word choice and in her mannerisms, actually had the audacity to make a comment that I cannot quote word for word, but was essentially along the lines of, so video games aren't just for little kids, they're for older audiences sometimes. And that whole attitude basically summarizes what a lot of the mainstream media sources I saw, because I saw several like this, were treating this situation with, that a bunch of kids were upset about this. And when I say kids, I mean children. I mean, 10 and 12-year-olds at the top. These adolescents were all upset about this thing, never minding the fact that video games have not been at the purview of children for about a decade and a half at the least. And I would argue longer than that. And it was incredibly insulting. And listening to that, I wanted to walk up and smack her. And so the whole situation, from both sides, in my opinion, was poorly covered, and I think that it could have been handled better, and I sincerely doubt it will do anything to change anything in the future. Next question. Actually, how long have we got on the video here? Let's go ahead and do 2 more, because these are quick ones. What is my opinion on the Front Mission series? I got into this series really early on, and then I let it slide for quite a while. I picked it back up with Evolution, which I think came out a couple of years ago, something like that, which I enjoyed more than I thought I would, and probably more than I should admit to enjoying. It was one of those so bad it's good things. It was just laughably bad. Oh my goodness, the writing in the script was horrible. The gameplay was fun. And it was a very fun popcorn game, and so, I got into it. It's just, wow. And the last question is, what is my opinion on Space Rangers? Unfortunately, I never actually got a hold of a copy of these games, much to my dismay, as when they came out, I did have my eye on them, and wanted to pick them up. They sounded the kind of thing I'd like, the whole Elite thing again, the Elite Frontier, just explore the universe kind of thing. Obviously it wasn't the universe, but that kind of gameplay is something I've always gotten into since the beginning, and I really did enjoy that, and I wish I could have gotten into it. But getting a hold of games like that over here in the States is much more difficult than it sounds without getting into illegitimate territory, which I didn't do then, and I don't do now. And I'll go on record on that, on saying that, but I've already talked about that in a previous Q&A. And now I'm going to go ahead and pause, because it's almost 9, which means I need to start my shift. So I hopefully will have some time after I get my work done for the rest of the night in order to do the rest of the Q&A. I think it looks like I'm about halfway through the questions. Never mind the questions I got today from the Q&A I posted last night, which I'll have to get to as well. But either way, I will talk to you guys later.